Aki Lehtinen from Nankai University in Tianjin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. As I told everybody yesterday, I'm a philosopher, an economist, and neither. I do both. So today I'm going to talk about macroeconomics and about core models. Just a little introduction first. We look at the fact that macroeconomics is dominated by a particular modeling framework, the so-called DSG, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. These models are based on micro foundations in the sense of rational expectations, representative consumer, and they assume intertemporal optimizations. And I take it as given that everybody agrees that these assumptions are known to be seriously problematic. So here's the puzzle. The way in which, for example, Olivier Blanchard would say DSG models are based on seriously flawed assumptions empirically estimated by means of unconvincing methods, and normative implications that are crucial for policy advice are consequently implausible. And then the next sentence is, yet the basic DSG modeling choices are obviously the right ones. Where else could one begin? So how can this be? He's a famous economist. He says, it's seriously wrong, but it's obviously right. So one justification for these DSG models is that they provide some kind of a coherent framework of analysis. And when macroeconomists talk about core models, I believe that they appeal to this kind of justification. The core models, the title, refers to some terminology that macroeconomists themselves are using. It's not defined anywhere clearly. Nobody has done it. And this is part of the reason why I'm going to talk about it today. Nobody knows what it is exactly. But more precisely, I'm going to look at a possible philosophical, methodological justification for talking about core models, which goes in terms of the so-called Duhem-Quine thesis and the ways of solving it. So the Duhem-Quine thesis says that it's impossible to know which component in a complex and large model is confirmed or disconfirmed when you have a piece of evidence that confirms or disconfirms. So you can't allocate the blame to individual assumptions. Okay? And so when I talk about Duhemian problems, I mean the problem of finding out which parts of the model get confirmation. And more broadly, the idea is that macroeconomists and central bankers, they need to know what causes what in the economy. So to be able to solve, to be able to get to know about these things, you have to solve the Duhemian problems in some way. Okay. But then again, having a core model is costly, and we will soon see why. And there are also alternatives. For example, agent-based economics. I conclude that solving the Duhemian problems must be hugely important because it's there's a cost to pay, an obvious one, and they still do it. And I also believe that other justifications for these models are faulty, or at least not sufficiently convincing to justify their dominant position. So primarily I now refer to the so-called Lucas critique and the idea that DSG models are based on the idea that we have to provide a convincing answer to the so-called Lucas critique. So the Lucas critique, if you don't remember from your economics macro classes anymore, was the idea that the Keynesian models before in the 70s and 60s assumed that people don't change their behavior at all when the policy changes, particularly when the monetary policy changes. Okay. So So here's a final piece to introduce the topic. I read from Driffield this, the kind of problem that they see. Some people have taken heterogeneity to the extreme of agent-based modeling, describing explicitly the behavior of several, perhaps many different agents, possibly disposing of other assumptions such as rational expectations in the process. While this buys descriptive realism, does it go too far in the direction of loosening restrictions on models and allowing them to fit any conceivable data? So this is another thing that they are afraid of. The philosophers call this so-called underdetermination of theory by evidence. So the theory doesn't say the evidence doesn't clearly distinguish which theory is correct and which is not. Okay. And the bolded sentence from Blanchard was what got me working on this topic in the first place. This is a direct quote where it says, "Agent-based modelers have not provided a core model." So what I'm trying to do is, why does it say this, and what does it mean, and is it justified? So the idea with this paper is to see whether, in fact, the DSG models are able to solve these kind of Tuhemian problems in a convincing way. And I will contrast the DSG models with some agent-based macroeconomics. Okay. So what I'm going to do is here, I just first look at what core models are. And then I look at micro foundations, how they relate to core models, and then I look at a little bit on the methodology of agent-based macro. Okay. So just to start off, before the financial crisis, macroeconomists often did not really think that we need several different kinds of models in the first place. There was just one kind of model, and that's it. And for some reason, this, again, Blanchard in another paper, it distinguished between 5 different kinds of models: foundational, policy, toy, and so on, and forecasting, just saying, look, we have different functions for different models. And even this seemed to be a news to a lot of people in the macroeconomics. They somehow failed to think in these terms. The setting is really for this paper is a whole issue in Oxford Review of Economic Policy in 2018, where Vines and Wills are the editors, and what they did, they organized a conference and they asked some major economists, macroeconomists, what, if anything, is wrong with the current core model? And when they said the current core model, what they meant is the Cristiano, Eichenbaum, Evans, and the later sort of reincarnation of that in terms of Smets and Walters 2007. So they specified that this is the core model, so to speak. So what's wrong with it and what should be done about it, they asked. So this Oxford Review of Economic Policy 2018, there's one volume that's only methodology of macro by the economists. Okay, I read them all, and that's how I got interested in this. But I go straight to the conclusions. Their conclusions were that there's consensus that the current core model is inadequate, and then there was 4 main families of changes. You have to introduce financial frictions. They have partly done that already. And you have to relax rational expectations. You have to include heterogeneous agents. And during the last 2-3 years, the work like this has begun to appear. This is a big thing, it's Kaplan et al. And Robustness, because these are models that have, I wouldn't call it heterogeneous properly because you have 2 kinds of agents, but at least you don't have just one kind of agent. And then you have to underpin the model and the new additions with more appropriate macro foundations. So now let's look at what a core model is. So this is a list of meanings that I was able to see in the macroeconomic methodology literature. So first is that the Bank of England called its own sort of computer model that they used for analyzing the economy the core non-core model, where the idea is that there's a part of the model that's shielded from empirical testing. So they only let empirical testing to sort of lead to changes in non-core elements, but there's an unchanging core as well. Then you could see some people talk about a simple enough model to be taught to graduate students. So there's a problem of economics is difficult, and they believe that they cannot teach too many models because the students are not able to learn so many. So they want to have some kind of core model to focus ideas for that reason. And then some people say it's a codification of what should be regarded as the most important characteristics of macroeconomies. Furthermore, some people talk about it as whichever model a central bank uses as a starting point in its decision making. And finally, people talk about it in terms of a benchmark. And when they talk about it in terms of a benchmark, then if it is a benchmark, then it might be able to solve the Duhemian problems that I talked to you about. So the most important meanings I'm going to look at is this codification of what should be regarded as the most important characteristics of macroeconomies and a benchmark. But it's somewhat important that there are these other justifications for it as well. So what's the cost of having just one dominant model? So here's part of the problem. Trichet was the head of the central bank, European Central Bank, when the crisis hit. And what he said in 2010 is that policymakers had to seek advice from history to figure out what to do, rather than macroeconomics, because macroeconomics didn't have the theory that they needed. And then some people like Krugman say that look what they actually did. They went back to ISLM in practice, and no theoretical justification, so to speak, for what the central banks did. And then Ren-Lewis specifies the cost more precisely. Had top economics journals been more tolerant to different approaches, more intellectual resources would have been allocated to different approaches, and the crisis could have been handled better. So here the idea is that there was such a stranglehold on the methodology of macro models that many different kinds of models looking at different things about the macroeconomy were not developed in the first place. And when the crisis hit, they had no theory to go on at all. They just had to use intuition and knowledge about history. And well, if you think about it, there couldn't be much worse of a failure for macroeconomics. It turned out to be completely useless when the crisis hit. So I don't think the main problem with the crisis was the fact that they were not able to predict it. Predicting is just hard. But the more serious problem was that they had no theory to even analyze what happened. So if you think about the failure, this is the kind of failure that cannot be prevented by agreeing on what features the next core model should include. It's rather prevented by not having a core model in the first place. So I'm extremely worried the macroeconomists are having a methodological discussion about what ought to be done. And they all seem to be talking about core models. They all seem to be taking for granted that it's important to have core models. And when at the same time we have this kind of problem that if we just fix the next core model, there's no guarantee that we will not have the same kind of problem when the next economic crisis hits. So if we think about it this way, we probably don't know what will be the reason for the next economic crisis and when it will come. But we had better be prepared, and the only way to be prepared is to let a few more flowers bloom and not just one core family of models. Okay, so what does it mean to be a benchmark? What I get from the writings is that it's a structure that's known to all. It entails results that everybody knows, and the point is that when you modify the benchmark by adding elements, removing elements, and then you see how these affect the results in the economy. And you can only study basically the results by looking at the whole class of models that have somewhat different assumptions. That's the way you learn about what's causing what. So what's driving the results is seen from the comparisons. So very briefly, if I show you what's going on here, the Duhem-Quine thesis can be put in this way. You have some hypotheses that you want to test, and the idea with Popper, for example, is that you derive consequences from that. So observable consequences are like this. But you can't make this directly from the hypotheses. You need a kind of auxiliaries, further assumptions to do it. So I just put a dot there to mean a conjunction. So we have something like A1, A2, A3. So this is the first model. Then you get this confirming evidence. This is a tilde saying not all. This is falsified. But the conclusion, and now we have an argument, is that what we can falsify is the whole conjunction. But we can't tell which component here is the culprit. Okay. So the idea with having several models is that then we modify things a little bit, and and we do the same thing here, for example, but we use a different auxiliary instead of this one. And then we can see, we can compare the effect of A3 and A4. This is the kind of thing I mean with being a benchmark. Okay. So this is the way in which you solve the Duhem-Quine problem. You have a family of models and you look at what affects what.
To the extent that you are able to do it, because the more intervenient steps, the combinatorics of that will increase.
Yes, of course, this is presuming that you can do it, but you cannot do it with all components. But I'm just showing the logic of it, how it is that you learn. Okay. Okay, so next, let's have a brief look at macrofoundations. So the official line is that you have the Lucas critique, and what follows from that is the necessity of microfounded models and the injunction to derive general equilibrium consequences of every proposed model change. So when I look at the people, what they write about this, they say microfoundations ensure clarity and rigor. They help to keep the logic straight. They give microfounded models give a good feel for what changes with policy changes and what doesn't. So this is an expression of, they are claiming that we can do this kind of thing with microfounded models, but not other kind of models. Okay. And some people like Ren Lewis, who's really a critique, is saying that, okay, what you get is internal consistency because you have microeconomics and macroeconomics, and it's a one coherent theory. And then I just like to point out that some people also distinguish between being consistent with microeconomics and being consistent with microeconomic data. And this is what the strong and weak form of micro-foundations refer to. And then, of course, when we think about it, the micro-foundations is based on the idea that people are rational. They engage in intertemporal optimization. So what happens if they're not rational? The problem for methodology is that irrational behavior is kind of ad hoc. There's no single way in which you would sort of put irrational behavior into a macro model. In contrast, there's only one rational behavior. That's probably the reason why these guys talk about consistency and rigor and so on. So the fear is that if you have a model that has both rational and irrational elements, is somehow inconsistent, and hence there's the fear that the possibility of figuring out what depends on what is lost. Okay. But my question is this really correct? Is this a good argument? The problem is just that, and now I quote again from Faust, the key problem with these G models has been that agents in the model seem to be willing to substitute between current and future consumption when given a small incentive to do so. The problem explains why habit formation, adjustment costs, and persistent shocks to more general conditions have been added to the core model. So the problem is that there's the framework is based on intertemporal maximization, but according to the data, people are not behaving this way. So this is a piece of falsifying evidence, but it's such a core element of the model that they're not willing to give up. Okay. And what this also means is that, well, we have to introduce habit formation and Calvo pricing, all these kind of tricks in order to accommodate the data. But if you, so the problem is, how can we be sure that despite these kind of modeling tricks, the model is still able to reliably indicate what depends on what? Okay, so actually the rigor and logic, and especially this kind of argument that we're having here, might be lost because we have to modify the model in ways that we know are false. Okay. And then one big problem has been this heterogeneity, and I want to quote again by somebody. Once one allows for heterogeneous agents together with asymmetric information, it's difficult to make the fundamentals-driven rational expectations seriously as a benchmark assumption. Well, now that we have these models, this could be a major change because it has now been done in mainstream macro. These are considered to be mainstream macro models. So it could be that we just had a revolution in macroeconomics in 2018. Okay. Let me just briefly, if I have time, mention what the people who defend the mainstream want to say about this. So there's a recent paper that's a response to the papers in the Oxford Review from Christian Eichenbaum and Trabant. So they say, so why would anyone ever use the representative agent assumption? In practice, analysts have used that assumption because they think that for many questions they get roughly the right answer. For example, the answer that the standard DSG model gives to monetary policy questions hinges on a key property. A policy-induced cut in the interest rate leads to an increase in consumption. And then in the same paper they say the Euler equation is satisfied in all dates and states of nature. There's overwhelming empirical evidence against this perspective on how consumption decisions are made. Now basically the Euler equation is derived from intertemporal maximization. So what they're saying is that, look, we get the right answer even though we know that it's based on something that's wrong. But But the interesting thing is that you don't find this in the final version. Now that it's published, it's no longer there. What you have instead, motivated by these observations, macroeconomists are exploring DSG models where heterogeneous consumers face idiosyncratic shocks and binding borrowing constraints. Blah, 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 blah. So what I'm trying to say with this is that I find the original draft version much more sort of indicative of how they think about this than the final version. It could also be that, as I said, we have a revolution in 2018 in macroeconomics, and they're just reflecting on that. Okay. Then finally, just I want to briefly mention that in macroeconomics there's quite some work on the statistics of testing these models, and it has now been sort of widely acknowledged. By the paper by Sala and Canova kind of show that most DSG models are not identified, or the identifying restrictions are implausible. So identification is roughly the same kind of thing as philosophers talk about in terms of Duhan-Quine problems. So if your model is not identified, you don't know exactly where the confirmation is going, because you don't know that you have you don't know which model it goes to, so to speak. So we can perhaps ask, was it really the case that the previous call models ever provided reliable comparisons between models? Did they really solve the Duhan-Quine problem, despite the fact that they had to introduce falsities in order to be able to accommodate the data, and despite the fact that the identification is not really working for these models? Perhaps not. Now, so an obvious way to provide micro foundations without a representative consumer is with agent-based simulations. So in case you don't know how these work, there's no equilibrium in these models. Instead, you define a number of agents, and they have some preferences and behavior rules, and then they interact in a computer simulation, and then you look at what the outcome of the interaction is. Okay? That's roughly what an agent-based model is. So they are individualist in the sense that there are individuals, but of course typically the different individuals are different, so you have much more heterogeneity here than in the mainstream macro models. And of course this is an easy way of studying heterogeneity. But the problem with the agent-based models from the point of view of macroeconomists is that, well, let's look at the paper by de Grauwe, for example. He presents a model like this where animal spirits allows us to generate the financial crisis in an agent-based model. The problem is that this is too easy. The models are too flexible. You can change just about everything, and also there's this lack of control means that again you don't know which component exactly was the most important in generating the crisis. So it's difficult to see what exactly is responsible for the results, basically. There's also in principle difference that in analytical models you can see from the mathematics a little bit what affects what, but unless you look very, very carefully at the code and the individual interactions, it's more difficult to see what's driving the results in an agent-based models. So the problem is that ABMs are too different from standard macro models. If they were closer, we would be able to compare. And also they're too different from each other to allow for comparisons. So there's some justice to saying that the problem with the agent-based models is that they don't provide a proper answer to this question, to the Duhamian problems. Okay, precisely because they're too different from each other. If we change everything there, take all the assumptions away, and put all assumptions different here, we can't compare because they have nothing in common. And that's more or less what seems to be the situation now in agent-based macro. And well, perhaps the last critique is just a matter of the field being so new that econometrics has not been developed so well yet. I found one paper that's doing this, but it's not much. So, well, the good thing is nevertheless that because just about any assumption can be changed in an agent-based model, and if we can do this one assumption at a time, we can see what depends on what. So in a way, you still get the same, still get the comparison, still get to see a little bit of what's affecting what. So what you can do is you can test the robustness of analytical models with agent-based models. And now let me just say that the agent-based community already acknowledges and understands the problem. And as a reflection of that, you see people are presenting models, and they want to. These words are in the title of these papers, benchmark, baseline. So they want to say, look, I want to provide you with a core model. I want to give you a benchmark. Let's use this as the beacon, okay? But I find more interesting, more useful perhaps for the time being, the approach by Gobbi and Grazzini. So what they did is they took a standard New Keynesian DSG model from Woodford and just coded in all the assumptions that Woodford has, except that it's based, there's no equilibrium assumption. The model is solved with the agent interaction, okay? Just like an agent-based model is. And what you can see is that the model almost perfectly replicates Woodford's results when it's forced to model Woodford's assumption. So one way to put this is that it demonstrates that the assumption of general equilibrium doesn't really affect the results too much. It didn't matter that there was no equilibrium. But then it also compares rational expectations with perturbed signals on aggregate productivity, and then there is a difference. So I find this extremely interesting because this provides a bridge for the mainstream people to look at what depends on what. So here we start from the mainstream model, but we build an agent-based simulation on that, and then because of the flexibility, we get to know what depends on what. And in this case, it seems somewhat plausible to me that the equilibrium assumption didn't matter, but what does matter is if you have rational expectations or not. Okay. So to conclude, we need to know what depends on what, both in reality and in the model. And I also believe that the ABM community should follow Gobbi and Grazzini rather than Legnick and Kayani and so on. Because I find it important that it would be more important to change the mainstream itself rather than provide yet another alternative. So how should I put this? Broadening the mainstream is, I think, more useful for communication than sort of providing again another sort of silo where people develop their own thing and don't communicate with anybody else. So the question was, is having a core model necessary for knowing what depends on what? And well, my answer at the moment is that, well, perhaps not. You can have just pairwise comparisons of assumptions can be conducted without any kind of a core model. So the difficulty is that how do we construct the models in such a way that we can rule out compensating errors within the model. And then if you accept my conclusion that the core models are ultimately not needed for providing a benchmark, if you accept my conclusion that the core models are not needed for solving the Duhem-Quine problem, then perhaps are the other gains sufficient to explain the mainstream economist quest for having them? So they are simple, they are known to all, and well, the problem is I'm not sure if there's agreement on the most important causal mechanism. And finally, I find it almost a bit dangerous to think that everybody should be learning the same core model in macroeconomics graduate courses in this world. So going back to the costs with having a core model, this could be just dangerous rather than useful. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. And we can open